Monowitz began as a factory site before it became known as one of the most infamous labor camps connected to Auschwitz. Built beside industrial plants and railway lines in occupied Poland, the camp was designed around production, expansion, and organized labor. Smoke rose constantly above construction zones. Trains arrived through carefully coordinated schedules. Roads connected warehouses, workshops, and factory buildings into a growing industrial landscape. Yet behind this appearance of efficiency stood an environment shaped by exhaustion, surveillance, and total control. Unlike other camps that were hidden deep within forests or isolated countryside, Monowitz existed as part of a massive industrial project tied directly to wartime production. Every section of the camp revolved around labor. Barracks were positioned near work sites. Daily routines followed factory schedules. Movement, rest, and even time itself became connected to industrial demands imposed by the authorities overseeing the camp. For prisoners arriving at Monowitz, the environment immediately revealed its purpose. Endless construction, machinery, rail transport, and organized labor columns created the atmosphere of a place where human existence had been reduced to function and output. The boundaries between factory and camp became almost impossible to separate. Inside Monowitz, routine shaped every hour of daily life. Roll calls before dawn, movement toward factory zones, constant observation, and the pressure of industrial production created a system where labor was not simply part of imprisonment, but the foundation of the camp itself. In this documentary, we will explore the origins of Monowitz, its connection to Auschwitz and industrial expansion, the daily structure of forced labor inside the camp, the atmosphere created by constant production and surveillance, and the lasting historical meaning left behind after the collapse of the system. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Industrial Vision Behind Monowitz. As one considers the origins of Monowitz, it becomes evident that the camp emerged not only from the broader expansion of Auschwitz but also from the industrial ambitions shaping German wartime policy across occupied Europe, and as this develops, the relationship between industry, transportation, and forced labor becomes increasingly central to understanding why Monowitz was created in the first place, where the camp existed not as an isolated detention site hidden from economic activity, but as a carefully positioned labor center connected directly to factory construction, chemical production, railway systems, and industrial planning, and this integration shaped every aspect of the environment from its earliest stages, and as one reflects on the location selected for the camp near the village of Monowitz in occupied Poland, it becomes clear that geography itself played an essential role in the project, where rail access, available land, nearby resources, and proximity to Auschwitz created conditions considered ideal for large-scale industrial expansion, and these practical considerations transformed the surrounding landscape into a space increasingly dominated by construction, transportation, and administrative organization. And as this develops further, the role of the German chemical company IG Farben becomes increasingly significant, where industrial leaders sought to build a massive synthetic rubber and fuel production complex tied directly to wartime manufacturing demands, and this project required enormous labor forces capable of sustaining rapid construction and continuous industrial activity, and it was within this context that Monowitz emerged as a camp built specifically to supply labor for the expanding factory zone. And as we consider the sensory aspects of the environment during these early stages, it becomes evident that Monowitz was defined by constant industrial motion even before the camp fully developed, where heavy machinery, railway, traffic, construction sounds, movement of materials, and organized labor operations created an atmosphere of continuous expansion across the landscape, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that the camp and factory were inseparable parts of the same operational system. And as this develops, the relationship between infrastructure and control becomes increasingly apparent, where roads, rail lines, fence compounds, administrative buildings, and construction zones were arranged according to principles of efficiency and supervision, ensuring that labor, transportation, and movement could function within tightly organized structures, and this organization reflected the broader wartime emphasis on industrial coordination and centralized planning, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz represented a new phase within the concentration camp system itself, where industrial production and camp administration became directly connected through shared operational goals, and this connection altered the nature of confinement by tying daily existence almost entirely to factory labor and industrial schedules, and as this develops further, the physical transformation of the surrounding environment becomes increasingly significant, where open fields and rural spaces gradually disappeared beneath construction sites, rail infrastructure, workshops, storage areas, and expanding factory buildings, and this transformation reshaped not only the landscape itself but also the atmosphere surrounding the region, replacing ordinary rural rhythms with the constant movement of industrial wartime activity, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners arriving during this period of expansion, it becomes clear that first impressions of Monowitz were shaped heavily by the visible scale of construction and organized labor surrounding the camp, where smokestacks, machinery, railway lines, and endless building activity communicated immediately that the environment existed primarily for production and industrial output, and this awareness distinguished Monowitz from many other camps within the broader Auschwitz system, and as this develops, the connection between industry, labor, and confinement becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operational identity of the camp, and thus the origins of Monowitz can be understood as the result of industrial ambition, combined with wartime administration, creating an environment where factory expansion and forced labor became inseparable parts of a single organized system built upon control, transportation, and production. As the industrial project surrounding Monowitz expanded further, the camp itself gradually evolved into a highly organized labor environment built entirely around the needs of factory construction and production, and it becomes evident that every aspect of the camp's development reflected the growing integration between industrial planning and systems of confinement, where barracks, transportation routes, labor schedules, and administrative structures were designed according to the operational demands of the nearby IG Farben complex, and as this develops, the relationship between factory growth and camp expansion becomes increasingly clear, where the physical enlargement of industrial facilities directly shaped the growth of Monowitz itself, creating a system in which the camp functioned as an extension of the industrial landscape surrounding it, and this integration transformed the environment into one defined by constant labor activity and organized movement, and as one reflects on the construction process shaping the area, it becomes clear that Monowitz emerged during a period of massive wartime industrial expansion where engineers, administrators, guards, railway personnel, and labor groups all contributed to the transformation of the region into a coordinated production zone connected to larger economic and military objectives, and this broader industrial vision shaped not only the physical structure of the camp, but also the routines and systems governing daily life within it. And, as this develops further, the role of transportation infrastructure becomes increasingly significant, where railway lines connected Monowitz to Auschwitz and to wider networks extending across occupied Europe, allowing movement of construction materials, industrial equipment, administrative personnel, and prisoners through carefully coordinated logistical systems, and these transportation networks reinforced the understanding that Monowitz operated not as an isolated environment but as part of a larger industrial machine tied directly to wartime production. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere surrounding Monowitz was shaped heavily by industrial sound and movement, where trains passed regularly through nearby rail yards, machinery operated across construction sites, factory equipment produced constant mechanical noise, and organized labor columns moved through roads and work zones according to fixed schedules, and this atmosphere created a sense of uninterrupted operational activity defining the environment from morning until night. And as this develops, the relationship between labor and time becomes increasingly apparent, where daily existence inside Monowitz revolved around industrial schedules rather than ordinary social rhythms, and this transformation shaped how prisoners experienced the passage of days, linking routine directly to factory demands and production goals imposed by the camp administration and industrial authorities. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz represented a particularly direct example of how industrial systems and concentration camps became intertwined during the war, where human labor was treated as a controlled resource managed through schedules, transportation systems, supervision, and administrative classification, and this integration altered the structure of camp life itself by making production the central organizing principle of the environment. And as this develops further, the physical appearance of the camp increasingly reflected its industrial purpose, where barracks stood near construction zones, roads connected directly to factory areas, storage sites expanded beside rail lines, and fences separated laborers from the industrial complexes surrounding them, creating an atmosphere in which confinement and production existed side by side within the same operational framework. And as we consider the perspective of those living and working within Monowitz during its expansion, it becomes clear that awareness of the surrounding industrial system shaped perception of the camp itself, where prisoners constantly observed machinery, factory growth, transportation activity, and organized labor movement as unavoidable parts of daily existence. And this awareness reinforced the understanding that Monowitz functioned primarily as a labor camp, designed to sustain industrial production through tightly controlled systems of work and supervision. And as this develops, the connection between industrial planning, transportation, infrastructure, and forced labor becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in maintaining the operational structure of the camp and factory complex. And thus, the industrial vision behind Monowitz can be understood as the foundation upon which the entire environment was constructed, shaping its geography, routines, labor systems, and atmosphere as a camp built directly around factory production and wartime industrial expansion. Chapter 1, Segment 2: Construction, Expansion, and the Growth of the Factory Camp. As one considers the rapid development of Monowitz following the establishment of the industrial project near Auschwitz, the process of construction itself becomes one of the defining features shaping the environment of the camp, and it becomes evident that Monowitz emerged through continuous expansion, where factories, rail systems, roads, storage facilities, and barracks developed simultaneously as part of a single coordinated wartime project. And as this develops, the relationship between construction and labor becomes increasingly central, where prisoners themselves were forced to participate directly in building the environment that confined them, carrying materials, preparing foundations, laying roads, and working across construction zones. Connected to the growing industrial complex, and this integration of labor into construction shaped both the physical appearance of Monowitz and the daily experience of those imprisoned within it. And as one reflects on the landscape before the camp expanded, it becomes clear that the area surrounding Monowitz had once been largely rural, marked by fields, open ground, scattered buildings, and ordinary village life, yet wartime industrial planning transformed this environment rapidly into a heavily organized production zone dominated by machinery, transport, infrastructure, and factory construction, and this transformation altered the atmosphere of the region itself, replacing agricultural rhythms with the constant activity of industrial development. And as this develops further, the role of the IG Farben industrial complex becomes increasingly significant, where factory construction expanded on an enormous scale, requiring vast amounts of labor and materials to sustain continuous development, and this industrial pressure directly shaped the growth of Monowitz as barracks and administrative facilities multiplied in order to support increasing prisoner populations assigned to the project. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that construction defined the atmosphere surrounding the camp, where heavy equipment, movement of rail cars, hammering, mechanical noise, organized labor, columns, and constant transportation activity created a landscape of uninterrupted industrial expansion, and this atmosphere reinforced awareness that Monowitz functioned not simply as a camp but as part of a massive construction and production operation extending across the surrounding area. And as this develops, the physical organization of the environment becomes increasingly apparent, where roads connected factory buildings to storage zones and rail yards, while fences, guard towers, and barracks established the structures of confinement directly beside industrial work areas. And this arrangement reflected the broader principle that labor and imprisonment would operate together within the same coordinated system. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the expansion of Monowitz represented more than the growth of a labor camp alone, functioning instead as the creation of an entirely new industrial landscape built upon forced labor, administrative planning, and wartime production goals. And this broader transformation reshaped not only the physical region but also the daily rhythms governing existence within it. And as this develops further, the relationship between movement and expansion becomes increasingly significant, where transportation systems carried materials, workers, administrators, and prisoners continuously through the growing industrial zone, reinforcing the atmosphere of permanent activity and organized coordination defining Monowitz. And this movement connected the camp directly to wider wartime systems operating across occupied Europe. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners arriving during these years of construction, it becomes clear that first impressions of Monowitz were dominated by scale and motion, where endless construction zones, smokestacks, rail activity, and expanding factory structures created the sense of an environment constantly growing beyond visible boundaries. And this perception shaped awareness of the camp as a place organized entirely around labor and industrial production. And as this develops, the connection between construction, forced labor, and industrial expansion becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operational identity of Monowitz, and thus the construction and growth of the camp can be understood as part of a broader industrial transformation in which wartime production and systems of confinement merged into a single organized environment built upon continuous expansion and forced labor. As the expansion of Monowitz continued, the camp increasingly took on the appearance of a fully developed industrial labor center where construction, transportation, and production merged into a continuous operational system, and it becomes evident that growth itself became one of the defining characteristics of the environment, where new barracks, roads, railway connections, workshops, storage facilities, and factory structures appeared steadily across the landscape, reshaping the area into a highly organized zone of industrial activity connected directly to wartime production demands. And as this develops, the relationship between expansion and administration becomes increasingly clear, where the growth of the camp required increasingly complex systems of supervision, scheduling, transportation coordination, and labor organization, and these administrative structures reinforced the broader operational identity of Monowitz as both a factory complex and a concentration camp labor site functioning simultaneously, and as one reflects on the pace of construction during this period, it becomes clear that the industrial project surrounding Monowitz operated under constant pressure to expand production capacity, where factory buildings rose rapidly beside rail lines and construction zones remained active across nearly every section of the environment, and this pressure shaped the routines imposed upon prisoners whose labor became directly tied to the physical growth of the industrial landscape itself. And as this develops further, the role of transportation infrastructure becomes increasingly important, where trains delivered machinery, building materials, fuel, and industrial equipment into the region, while also connecting Monowitz to Auschwitz and wider railway systems extending throughout occupied Europe, and these transportation routes reinforced the camp's integration into larger wartime economic structures beyond the immediate environment surrounding the factory. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that Monowitz was dominated by industrial sound and movement at nearly all hours, where machinery operated continuously, trains moved across nearby tracks, construction crews worked across expanding zones, and labor columns marched through roads connecting barracks to factory sites, creating an atmosphere defined by constant operational rhythm. And this atmosphere shaped perception of the camp by making industrial activity inseparable from daily existence itself. And as this develops, the relationship between factory space and confinement becomes increasingly interconnected, where barracks stood close to industrial zones and fenced boundaries separated prisoners from surrounding work areas without fully isolating them from the visual presence of the factory complex itself. And this arrangement reinforced awareness that the camp existed entirely to sustain industrial labor through systems of supervision and restricted movement. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz represented one of the clearest examples of industrialized forced labor within the Auschwitz system, where economic production and concentration camp administration operated together as parts of the same coordinated structure, and this integration revealed how wartime industry increasingly depended upon organized systems of confinement and exploitation. And as this develops further, the concept of environmental transformation becomes increasingly significant, where the original rural landscape surrounding Monowitz disappeared beneath expanding factory construction, railway systems, administrative compounds, and prisoner barracks, and this transformation altered the character of the region entirely, replacing ordinary village life with an industrial landscape built around production schedules, transportation logistics, and continuous labor activity, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners living and working within Monowitz during this period of rapid growth, it becomes clear that awareness of expansion shaped daily perception of the camp itself, where construction never seemed fully complete and industrial activity constantly extended into new sections of the environment, reinforcing the sense that Monowitz functioned as an ever-growing machine organized around labor and wartime production, and this awareness contributed to the broader atmosphere of exhaustion and industrial intensity defining life within the camp. And, as this develops, the connection between construction, transportation systems, and forced labor becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in maintaining the operational structure of Monowitz, and thus the growth of the factory camp can be understood as a continuous process through which industrial expansion and systems of confinement became physically and operationally inseparable within the broader wartime landscape surrounding Auschwitz. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Arrival, Registration, and First Impressions of Monowitz. As one considers the experience of arriving at Monowitz during the years of its expansion, the first encounter with the camp emerges as one of the most defining moments shaping perception of the environment and its purpose, and it becomes evident that arrival at Monowitz differed in important ways from arrival at many other camps within the Auschwitz system because the industrial landscape surrounding the camp immediately communicated that labor and production stood at the center of daily existence, and as this develops, the relationship between transportation and confinement becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners often arrived through railway systems already deeply connected to the factory complex itself, and this integration between rail infrastructure and camp administration reinforced the understanding that Monowitz functioned as part of a larger industrial network extending far beyond the visible boundaries of the camp. And as one reflects on the physical approach to Monowitz, it becomes clear that the environment surrounding the camp created a powerful first impression, where smokestacks, unfinished factory buildings, rail lines, construction cranes, storage zones, machinery, and endless movement across industrial work areas combined to create an atmosphere dominated by labor and expansion. And this industrial setting shaped awareness immediately upon arrival by signaling that the camp existed primarily to support production through organized forced labor, and as this develops further, the process of entering the camp becomes increasingly important, where guarded gates, fenced boundaries, organized intake areas, and visible systems of supervision transformed the transition into Monowitz into a carefully controlled administrative procedure, and this procedure reinforced the broader atmosphere of authority and regulation defining the camp from the moment prisoners entered its boundaries. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that arrival at Monowitz unfolded within an environment filled with industrial sound and operational activity, where trains moved along nearby tracks, machinery operated across construction zones, shouted commands echoed through open spaces, and labor groups marched between work areas according to fixed schedules. And this atmosphere shaped first impressions by surrounding prisoners immediately with the rhythms of factory labor and organized movement. And as this develops, the role of observation becomes increasingly central, where newly arrived prisoners attempted to understand the environment through visual and sensory details surrounding them, noting the scale of the factory complex, the organization of labor columns, the arrangement of barracks, and the visible systems of supervision operating throughout the camp, and this reliance upon observation became essential for adapting to an unfamiliar environment structured around industrial discipline and administrative control, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the process of arrival served not only to transport prisoners into confinement but also to introduce them immediately to the operational identity of Monowitz itself, where every visible feature of the environment communicated that labor, production, and industrial efficiency shaped the structure of daily existence, and this realization distinguished Monowitz from camps where confinement alone dominated first impressions, and as this develops further, the relationship between industrial expansion and camp atmosphere becomes increasingly apparent, where the unfinished and constantly growing appearance of the surrounding factory zones reinforced awareness that Monowitz remained part of an expanding wartime project still under active construction, and this atmosphere of continuous growth contributed to the perception of the camp as an industrial machine constantly demanding more labor and organization. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners arriving for the first time, it becomes clear that Monowitz appeared less like an isolated prison compound and more like a vast industrial territory organized through fences, schedules, transportation systems, and forced labor, and this perception shaped understanding of the camp from the very beginning of imprisonment. And as this develops, the connection between transportation, industry, and confinement becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the first experience of Monowitz, and thus the process of arrival at the camp can be understood as a carefully structured introduction into an environment where industrial production and concentration camp administration operated together within a single organized system built upon labor, supervision, and continuous expansion. As the process of arrival at Monowitz continued beyond the first encounter with the industrial landscape and guarded boundaries of the camp, the intake and registration procedures gradually introduced prisoners into the administrative structure governing daily life within the factory camp, and it becomes evident that these procedures were designed not only to organize large groups efficiently but also to transform individuals into components within a broader labor system built around classification, supervision, and industrial production, and as this develops, the relationship between registration and labor becomes increasingly apparent, where administrative intake processes were directly connected to factory needs and labor allocation systems, ensuring that prisoners entering Monowitz were immediately absorbed into the operational structure supporting the IG Farben complex and its surrounding industrial zones, and as one reflects on the spaces associated with registration, it becomes clear that these areas reflected the same atmosphere of order and efficiency visible throughout the camp itself, where guarded intake points, organized queues, administrative offices, and movement between designated sections created an environment structured around routine and visible control, and this organization reinforced the broader impression that Monowitz operated according to systems extending far beyond ordinary imprisonment, and as this develops further, the role of classification becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners were identified, documented, and assigned according to categories tied directly to labor requirements, camp administration, and transportation systems, and these classifications shaped later experiences inside the camp by influencing work assignments, living arrangements, and patterns of supervision within the industrial labor structure. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of registration combined administrative repetition with the constant background presence of industrial activity, where sounds of paperwork, commands, footsteps, machinery, and nearby railway movement blended together into a continuous operational rhythm surrounding the intake process, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that Monowitz functioned simultaneously as both a concentration camp and a massive industrial labor center, and as this develops, the concept of waiting becomes increasingly important, where prisoners often stood in organized formations for extended periods. During intake and inspection procedures, and these moments of waiting introduced an early experience of externally controlled time within the camp, where movement and activity depended entirely upon schedules and administrative direction imposed by authorities, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that registration at Monowitz represented more than a bureaucratic procedure alone, functioning instead as the formal transition through which prisoners entered a system organized around labor, industrial production, and continuous supervision, and this transition shaped perception by making clear that individual identity within the camp would now be defined primarily through work and administrative classification, and as this develops further, the relationship between environment and psychological adaptation becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners relied heavily upon observation of routines, labor, groups, schedules, and visible patterns of authority in order to understand how the camp functioned and how survival within its systems might be navigated, and this process of adaptation began immediately during registration itself, and as we consider the perspective of those moving through these intake procedures for the first time, it becomes clear that the industrial character of Monowitz remained impossible to separate from the experience of imprisonment, where factory, construction, machinery, transportation systems, and labor organization surrounded nearly every aspect of the environment, shaping awareness of the camp as a place entirely structured around production and organized labor, and this atmosphere contributed to the broader identity of Monowitz as Auschwitz's factory camp, where confinement and industrial expansion existed together within the same coordinated wartime system, and as this develops, the connection between registration, industrial organization, and administrative control becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in integrating prisoners into the operational structure of the camp, and thus the process of arrival and registration at Monowitz can be understood as the first stage through which individuals were absorbed into an environment built around industrial labor, continuous supervision, and the organized rhythms of wartime. Factory production. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Barracks, crowding, and the structure of daily living. As one considers the daily environment inside Monowitz after the completion of arrival and registration procedures, the barracks emerge as one of the most important spaces shaping the experience of imprisonment within the factory camp, and it becomes evident that these structures were designed not as places of comfort or privacy, but as organized living environments intended to support the broader industrial labor system operating around the camp, and as this develops, the relationship between living space and production becomes increasingly clear, where the arrangement of barracks, roads, assembly areas, and pathways reflected the same principles of efficiency and supervision that governed the nearby factory complex, and this integration ensured that daily life inside the camp remained closely tied to labor schedules and administrative control, and as one reflects on the physical appearance of the barracks themselves, it becomes clear that they were constructed according to practical and standardized designs focused on accommodating large numbers of prisoners within limited space, where rows of bunks, narrow walkways shared sleeping platforms, and minimal personal storage reinforced the collective and highly regulated nature of camp existence, and this arrangement reduced opportunities for privacy while increasing awareness of the constant presence of others living under the same conditions, And as this develops further, the concept of crowding becomes increasingly significant, where the expanding prisoner population connected to the growing industrial demands of Monowitz intensified pressure on available living space, and this overcrowding shaped movement, rest, and routine inside the barracks by creating an environment in which nearly every aspect of existence unfolded within close physical proximity to others. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the barracks possessed a distinct atmosphere shaped by continuous collective activity, where footsteps across wooden floors, movement between bunks, whispered conversations, coughing, distant factory sounds, and repeated inspections blended together into a constant background rhythm defining life inside the camp. And this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that even periods intended for rest remained connected to the larger systems of supervision and industrial operation surrounding Monowitz. And as this develops, the relationship between barracks and daily routine becomes increasingly apparent, where mornings began with organized preparation for labor details, while evenings ended with return from factory zones, inspections, and brief periods of limited rest before schedules repeated again. And this repetitive cycle shaped perception of time by linking ordinary activities directly to industrial labor demands imposed by the camp administration. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the barracks functioned not merely as sleeping quarters but as extensions of the factory system itself, where schedules, movement, inspections, and collective organization reinforced the operational identity of Monowitz as a labor camp built around production and efficiency. And this integration distinguished Monowitz from environments where industrial activity remained more distant from prisoner living spaces. And as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly central, where prisoners adapted to barrack life by closely observing routines, expectations, movement patterns, and the behavior of guards and prisoner functionaries, using familiarity with these systems to navigate daily existence more effectively. And this adaptation emerged gradually through repeated exposure to the rhythms of camp life. And as we consider the perspective of those living within the barracks over extended periods, it becomes clear that the structures shaped both physical and psychological experience inside Monowitz, where crowding, industrial noise, repetitive schedules, and constant collective presence reinforced the atmosphere of confinement defining the camp. And this awareness contributed to the broader perception of Monowitz as an environment where labor, supervision, and restricted movement governed every stage of daily existence. And as this develops, the connection between barracks, crowding, and industrial routine becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in maintaining the operational structure of the camp. And thus the barracks of Monowitz can be understood as foundational spaces within the factory camp system, shaping the rhythms, atmosphere, and collective experience of life inside an environment built around industrial labor and continuous supervision. As the routines of daily life inside Monowitz became more firmly established, the barracks increasingly shaped not only physical living conditions but also the collective psychology and awareness of those imprisoned within the camp. And it becomes evident that shared existence inside crowded living spaces created an environment where routine, observation, and adaptation became inseparable from ordinary daily experience. And as this develops, the concept of collective rhythm becomes increasingly significant, where large groups of prisoners adjusted themselves to common schedules governing waking, labor preparation, inspections, and return from work assignments. And this shared rhythm reinforced the broader structure of industrial organization, shaping life throughout Monowitz. and as one reflects on the atmosphere inside the barracks. During different times of day, it becomes clear that the environment changed according to the movement of labor schedules, where mornings were marked by hurried preparation and organized assembly, while evenings carried the exhaustion of return from factory work and construction zones, and these repeated transitions shaped how prisoners experienced both time and physical space inside the camp. And as this develops further, the relationship between crowding and awareness becomes increasingly apparent, where the close proximity of large numbers of people intensified attention to sound, movement, and routine within the barracks, creating an atmosphere in which silence was rare and collective presence remained constant, and this environment reinforced the understanding that personal existence inside Monowitz unfolded almost entirely within systems of shared confinement and organized supervision. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the barracks carried the sounds of both human activity and industrial labor simultaneously, where movement across bunks, coughing, whispered exchanges, inspections, distant machinery, railway traffic, and factory operations blended together into a continuous operational atmosphere extending from the industrial zones directly into the living quarters themselves, and this sensory overlap reinforced the inseparable relationship between factory production and camp existence defining Monowitz. And as this develops, the role of inspections and supervision inside the barracks becomes increasingly significant, where guards and prisoner functionaries maintain systems of order through repeated observation, assigned arrangements, and regulation of movement within living spaces, ensuring that even moments associated with rest remained connected to the broader structures of authority operating throughout the camp. And this integration reinforced the atmosphere of continuous control shaping daily life. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the barracks played a major role in reinforcing the industrial identity of Monowitz itself, where living spaces functioned according to the same principles of efficiency, repetition, and organized coordination, visible throughout the surrounding factory complex. And this organizational continuity shaped how prisoners understood the camp as a whole. And as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly nuanced, where prisoners learn to interpret routines, schedules, inspections, and movement patterns through careful observation of daily repetition, using familiarity with the structure of Baroque life to navigate the restrictive environment more effectively. And this adaptation reflected the gradual normalization of industrial routine within the experience of confinement itself. And as we consider the perspective of those living inside the barracks over extended periods, it becomes clear that these spaces became central reference points within memory of Monowitz, where exhaustion, routine, waiting, industrial sound, and collective existence all remain tied to the confined environment of the camp's living quarters. And this connection reinforced the broader perception of Monowitz as a factory camp where every section of daily life revolved around labor and organized production. And as this develops, the relationship between crowding, industrial rhythm, and supervision becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in shaping the operational atmosphere of the camp. And thus the barracks and living conditions inside Monowitz can be understood as essential components of the factory labor system itself, shaping the collective experience, psychological environment, and daily routines of those forced to exist within the industrial structure surrounding Auschwitz III. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Factory labor, exhaustion, and the rhythm of industrial production. As one considers the daily operation of Monowitz beyond the barracks and intake procedures, the system of factory labor emerges as the defining force shaping the structure and atmosphere of the camp, and it becomes evident that labor inside Monowitz was not treated as a secondary component of imprisonment but as the central purpose around which the entire environment had been constructed, and as this develops, the relationship between industrial production and daily existence becomes increasingly clear, where every schedule, movement pattern, inspection, transportation route, and administrative procedure revolved around maintaining a constant flow of labor toward the growing IG Farben industrial complex, and this integration transformed Monowitz into an environment where production and confinement operated together within the same organized system, and as one reflects on the beginning of the workday inside the camp, it becomes clear that factory labor shaped time itself, where prisoners rose before dawn according to strict schedules and assembled in organized formations before marching toward industrial work zones, and this repetitive movement reinforced awareness that daily existence unfolded entirely according to the rhythms of production and supervision imposed by camp authorities and factory administrators, and as this develops further, the scale of the industrial environment becomes increasingly significant, where enormous construction areas, unfinished factory buildings, pipelines, storage facilities, railway systems, and machinery dominated the landscape surrounding Monowitz, creating the impression of an industrial city under continuous expansion. And this atmosphere shaped first impressions of labor by making it clear that the camp existed primarily to sustain a massive wartime production project requiring constant physical work and organized coordination, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that factory labor created a distinct industrial rhythm across the environment, where machinery operated continuously, trains moved along nearby tracks, construction equipment echoed through open spaces, labor columns marched across roads, and repeated commands organized movement between sections of the industrial complex, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that Monowitz functioned through uninterrupted systems of production extending into every aspect of camp life, and as this develops, the relationship between labor and exhaustion becomes increasingly apparent, where long work hours, physically demanding construction tasks, exposure to weather, repetitive industrial activity, and constant supervision shaped the physical condition of prisoners while reinforcing the broader atmosphere of strain surrounding the camp, and this exhaustion became integrated into the daily rhythm of Monowitz itself, where labor dominated nearly every hour of existence, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the industrial labor system inside Monowitz represented a particularly direct connection between wartime production and forced labor within the concentration camp network, where economic goals and systems of confinement operated together through tightly organized structures of supervision and transportation, and this integration altered the meaning of imprisonment itself by tying survival directly to industrial output and labor performance, and as this develops further, the role of organization becomes increasingly central, where work assignments, transportation routes, labor details, inspections, and schedules were coordinated carefully in order to sustain continuous production across the expanding industrial zone, and this organization reinforced the operational identity of Monowitz as a factory labor camp built around efficiency and wartime demand, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners moving daily through these industrial spaces, it becomes clear that awareness of machinery, construction, schedules, and factory expansion shaped understanding of the camp environment itself, where industrial production appeared endless and continuous, extending beyond visible boundaries into a larger wartime system impossible to fully observe from inside the camp, and this awareness contributed to the atmosphere of Monowitz as a place defined by labor and industrial intensity. And as this develops, the connection between production, exhaustion, and confinement becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping daily existence. Within the camp, and thus, factory labor at Monowitz can be understood as the central mechanism through which industrial expansion, administrative control, and prisoner life became inseparably linked within the operational structure of Auschwitz's factory camp. As factory labor became more deeply integrated into the routines of Monowitz, the industrial rhythm governing the camp increasingly shaped how prisoners experienced time, movement, and physical existence within the environment, and it becomes evident that production schedules functioned not only as organizational tools but as systems through which daily life itself was structured around continuous work and repetitive motion, and as this develops, the concept of industrial routine becomes increasingly significant, where each phase of the day unfolded according to the demands of factory construction, transportation logistics, and wartime production goals, creating an environment in which personal rhythms disappeared into the larger operational rhythm of the industrial complex surrounding the camp. And as one reflects on the movement of labor columns between barracks and work zones, it becomes clear that these repeated marches formed one of the most recognizable features of daily existence inside Monowitz, where prisoners traveled through roads lined with fences, railway tracks, construction materials, pipelines, and unfinished factory sections, and this repeated movement reinforced awareness that the camp and industrial complex operated together as parts of the same coordinated structure. And as this develops further, the relationship between labor and environment becomes increasingly apparent, where the factory landscape itself shaped the experience of work through its enormous scale, unfinished construction zones, mechanical infrastructure, and constant expansion, and this environment created the impression of a system continuously growing outward while demanding uninterrupted labor to sustain its development. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that industrial sound defined nearly every moment of daily life inside Monowitz, where machinery, train engines, construction equipment shouted instructions, footsteps of labor groups, and factory operations blended together into a continuous operational atmosphere extending from the industrial zones directly into the camp itself. And this sensory environment reinforced the understanding that production dominated the structure of existence within Monowitz, and as this develops, the role of supervision inside factory labor becomes increasingly significant, where guards, overseers, and prisoner functionaries maintain systems of observation and discipline throughout construction sites and industrial work areas, ensuring that labor activity aligned with production schedules and administrative expectations, and this visible supervision reinforced the broader atmosphere of control shaping the camp. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the exhaustion associated with factory labor inside Monowitz extended beyond physical strain alone, shaping psychological awareness through repetition, industrial intensity, and the continuous pressure of schedules organized entirely around production goals. And this atmosphere contributed to the perception of the camp as a place where labor had become the defining structure governing all aspects of existence. And as this develops further, the relationship between transportation systems and labor organization becomes increasingly interconnected, where railways, roads, loading zones, and supply routes supported the movement of materials and labor groups through carefully coordinated systems tied directly to factory operation, and this logistical coordination reinforced Monowitz's role within the larger wartime industrial network connected to Auschwitz and beyond, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners living within these industrial routines. Over extended periods, it becomes clear that awareness of machinery, construction schedules, transportation activity, and constant expansion shaped memory and perception of the camp itself, where factory labor appeared endless and inescapable within an environment built entirely around production and supervision, and this awareness contributed to the broader psychological atmosphere defining Monowitz as Auschwitz's industrial labor camp, and as this develops, the connection between industrial rhythm, exhaustion, and administrative control becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in maintaining the operational structure of the camp, and thus, factory labor and the exhausting routines of industrial production can be understood as the defining foundations of daily life inside Monowitz, shaping the physical environment, collective experience, and operational identity of the camp within the larger system of wartime forced labor and industrial expansion. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Roll calls, supervision, and the discipline of the factory camp. As one considers the systems that maintained order within Monowitz beyond factory labor itself, the routines of roll calls, inspections, and organized supervision emerge as central mechanisms, shaping the structure of daily existence inside the camp, and it becomes evident that discipline at Monowitz operated through repetition, visibility, and continuous regulation of movement, where the industrial purpose of the camp required highly coordinated systems capable of organizing large prisoner populations according to strict schedules tied directly to production demands, and as this develops, the relationship between discipline and industrial efficiency becomes increasingly clear, where roll calls, labor formations, inspections, and regulated movement functioned not only as security procedures but also as organizational systems supporting the uninterrupted operation of the surrounding factory complex, and this integration reinforced the operational identity of Monowitz as a labor camp built entirely around industrial production. And as one reflects on the beginning of the workday, it becomes clear that morning assemblies played a major role in shaping the atmosphere of the camp, where prisoners gathered in organized formations before dawn while guards and overseers supervised counting procedures and labor organization, and these assemblies transformed open spaces into highly controlled environments, defined by visibility, repetition, and collective discipline, reinforcing awareness that daily life unfolded entirely according to externally imposed schedules, and as this develops further, the physical arrangement of assembly areas becomes increasingly significant, where roads, fences, barracks, and factory routes connected directly to roll call grounds, ensuring that labor movement could proceed efficiently from living quarters to industrial work sites, and this layout reflected the broader emphasis on order and coordination shaping every section of the camp environment. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that roll calls created a distinct operational rhythm within Monowitz, where whistles shouted commands synchronized, footsteps, opening gates, distant machinery, and the movement of labor columns combined to create an atmosphere of continuous organization and supervision, and this atmosphere reinforced awareness that the camp functioned according to tightly regulated systems extending from barracks to factory zones without interruption, and as this develops, the relationship between visibility and control becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners assembled in open formations under direct observation before marching toward industrial work areas, and this Visibility reinforced the psychological atmosphere of discipline shaping daily existence inside the camp, where movement and behavior remained constantly exposed to supervision, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the systems of roll calls and inspections served not only practical administrative purposes but symbolic ones as well, where repeated assemblies demonstrated the authority of the camp administration through carefully organized displays of order and regulated movement, and this symbolism reinforced the broader structure of control governing both labor and confinement within Monowitz, and as this develops further, the role of repetition becomes increasingly central, where the same schedules, formations, and movement patterns returned each day with industrial regularity, shaping how prisoners experienced time within the camp through recurring cycles of assembly, labor, inspection, and return, and this repetition contributed to the atmosphere of exhaustion and continuity defining Monowitz as an industrial labor environment, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to these systems over extended periods, it becomes clear that familiarity with schedules, commands, routes, and supervisory patterns became essential for navigating daily life, where observation and awareness of routine allowed individuals to orient themselves within the highly controlled environment surrounding them, and this adaptation reflected the gradual normalization of industrial discipline within camp existence itself, and as this develops, the connection between supervision, labor organization, and industrial routine becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in maintaining the operational structure of Monowitz. And thus, roll calls and systems of supervision can be understood as foundational mechanisms, through which discipline, labor coordination, and industrial efficiency shaped the atmosphere and daily rhythms of Auschwitz's factory camp. As the routines of supervision and discipline became more deeply integrated into the operation of Monowitz, their influence extended beyond visible inspections and assemblies into the broader psychological environment shaping daily life inside the camp, and it becomes evident that control functioned not only through direct enforcement but through the constant awareness that movement, timing, posture, and routine remained continuously observed within an environment organized entirely around industrial production and administrative regulation, and as this develops, the concept of continuous observation becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners moved through roads, assembly grounds, factory routes, barracks, and labor sites under systems of supervision designed to maintain efficiency and discipline throughout every stage of the day, and this visibility shaped awareness by ensuring that ordinary activities unfolded within structures of organized control, and as one reflects on the relationship between industrial labor and supervision, it becomes clear that factory schedules required precise coordination between camp administration and labor organization, where transportation systems, work assignments, labor columns, and production demands all depended upon carefully regulated movement and timing, and this coordination reinforced the broader operational identity of Monowitz as a camp, functioning according to industrial rhythms rather than ordinary social patterns, and as this develops further, the atmosphere of discipline becomes increasingly apparent within the physical environment itself, where fences, guard towers, open assembly spaces, straight roads, and clearly defined labor routes created an environment structured for visibility and organized movement, and this layout ensured that prisoners remained exposed to observation while traveling between nearly every section of the camp and factory complex, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that discipline shaped the sounds and rhythms of Monowitz continuously, where whistles signal transitions between activities, commands directed labor, Movement, machinery echoed across factory zones, and synchronized footsteps of labor columns reinforced the atmosphere of repetitive industrial coordination defining daily life inside the camp, and this sensory environment contributed to the understanding that Monowitz operated as a tightly organized system in which labor and supervision function together without separation. And as this develops, the role of inspections and repeated counting procedures becomes increasingly significant, where assemblies before and after labor assignments reinforced administrative control by ensuring that every stage of daily existence remained structured through observation and verification, and these repeated procedures contributed to the broader psychological atmosphere of the camp by making routine itself a visible expression of authority. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that discipline inside Monowitz extended beyond maintaining security alone, functioning instead as an essential component of the industrial labor system itself, where production goals depended upon the constant regulation of movement, schedules, and physical organization within the camp, and this integration revealed how closely industrial efficiency and systems of confinement had become connected within Auschwitz III, and as this develops further, the relationship between routine and psychological adaptation becomes increasingly nuanced, where prisoners learn to interpret the structure of daily life through repeated exposure to schedules, commands, labor routes, and supervisory patterns, using familiarity with these systems to navigate the restrictive environment more effectively, and this adaptation reflected the gradual normalization of industrial discipline within the experience of imprisonment itself, and as we consider the perspective of those living within these repetitive systems over extended periods, it becomes clear that supervision shaped not only physical movement but also perception of time, space, and identity inside the camp, where the constant repetition of assemblies, inspections, and labor coordination reinforced the understanding that every aspect of existence had been reorganized around factory production and administrative control, and this awareness contributed to the broader atmosphere of Monowitz as an environment where industrial expansion and systems of discipline operated together as parts of the same coordinated wartime structure. And as this develops, the connection between supervision, industrial rhythm, and psychological control becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in maintaining the operational identity of the camp, and thus the systems of roll calls, inspections, and discipline inside Monowitz can be understood as essential mechanisms through which authority organized labor, structured daily life, and sustained the industrial operation of Auschwitz's factory camp. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The Factory Landscape and the Transformation of the Environment. As one considers the broader environment surrounding Monowitz beyond the barracks and labor routines, the transformation of the landscape itself emerges as one of the most defining aspects of the camp's history, and it becomes evident that Monowitz was not simply placed within an industrial zone but actively reshaped the surrounding region into a massive production environment dominated by construction, transportation systems, factory expansion, and organized labor activity, and as this develops, the relationship between industrial growth and environmental transformation becomes increasingly clear, where fields, rural roads, villages, and open land gradually disappeared beneath rail infrastructure, factory buildings, storage zones, pipelines, roads, and prisoner compounds, creating an entirely new industrial geography connected directly to wartime production, and this transformation altered not only the physical appearance of the region but also the rhythms and atmosphere surrounding daily life within it, and as one reflects on the scale of the IG Farben complex near Monowitz, it becomes clear that the factory project represented one of the largest industrial construction efforts associated with the Auschwitz system, where synthetic fuel and rubber production facilities expanded continuously through enormous construction programs requiring vast quantities of materials, transportation, coordination, and forced labor, and this constant expansion reshaped the environment into a landscape of permanent industrial activity, and as this develops further, the role of infrastructure becomes increasingly significant, where railway lines connected construction zones to warehouses and loading areas while roads carried machinery, fuel, industrial equipment, and labor. Columns through carefully organized routes linking the camp directly to factory operations, and these systems reinforced the understanding that Monowitz functioned as part of a larger industrial machine extending far beyond the visible camp boundaries. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the environment surrounding Monowitz carried the sounds and atmosphere of uninterrupted industrial motion, where trains moved continuously across nearby tracks, machinery operated across construction sites, factory equipment echoed through open spaces, and smoke rose above expanding industrial buildings, creating an atmosphere defined by production and mechanical intensity, and this sensory environment shaped how prisoners perceived the camp by surrounding daily existence with constant reminders of the industrial system dominating the landscape, and as this develops, the relationship between factory growth and labor organization becomes increasingly apparent, where every stage of environmental transformation depended upon coordinated systems of forced labor, transportation, scheduling, and supervision, and this dependence reinforced the integration between industrial expansion and concentration camp administration defining Monowitz itself, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the transformation of the landscape surrounding Monowitz represented more than physical construction alone, functioning instead as the creation of a new wartime industrial territory built entirely around centralized planning, production goals, and organized labor exploitation, and this broader transformation reshaped how space, movement, and daily life operated within the region, and as this develops further, the visual appearance of the environment becomes increasingly significant, where endless construction zones, unfinished factory structures, smokestacks, cranes, storage compounds, pipelines, and guarded roads created an industrial horizon that appeared constantly unfinished and continuously expanding, and this appearance reinforced the perception that Monowitz existed within a project without visible limits, where labor and construction continued endlessly in service of wartime production, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners moving daily through this environment, it becomes clear that awareness of the surrounding industrial landscape shaped understanding of the camp itself, where the enormous scale of the factory complex and its constant growth communicated the immense operational system into which prisoners had been absorbed, and this awareness contributed to the broader atmosphere of Monowitz as a camp defined by industrial expansion and relentless labor, and as this develops, the connection between environmental transformation, industrial planning, and forced labor becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operational identity of Auschwitz's factory camp, and thus, the factory landscape surrounding Monowitz can be understood as both a physical and symbolic expression of wartime industrial ambition built upon organized systems of labor, transportation, and continuous expansion. As the industrial landscape surrounding Monowitz continued to expand, its influence reached far beyond the visible boundaries of the factory complex and deeply shaped the atmosphere, routines, and psychological experience of daily life within the camp, and it becomes evident that the transformation of the environment altered not only the physical geography of the region but also the way prisoners perceived movement, time, and existence inside the industrial system surrounding them, and as this develops, the concept of industrial immersion becomes increasingly significant, where nearly every direction visible from the camp revealed some aspect of construction, transportation infrastructure, factory activity, or organized labor movement, creating an environment in which industrial production dominated the horizon and shaped awareness continuously. And as one reflects on the visual structure of Monowitz and its surrounding factory zones, it becomes clear that the landscape itself communicated the priorities of the wartime system operating there, where roads connected directly to production sites, railway lines cut across the region carrying materials and equipment, storage compounds expanded beside industrial buildings, and smokestacks rose above nearly every section of the environment, reinforcing the understanding that production and expansion governed the entire region. And as this develops further, the relationship between factory growth and prisoner movement becomes increasingly apparent, where labor columns travel daily through roads lined with industrial infrastructure and construction zones, exposing prisoners repeatedly to the immense scale of the factory projects surrounding them, and this repeated movement reinforced the perception that Monowitz existed as part of a vast operational network extending beyond immediate visibility. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that industrial sound shaped the atmosphere of the camp almost constantly, where train engines, machinery, construction activity, metalwork, factory operations, shouted commands, and synchronized labor movement blended together into a continuous mechanical rhythm defining daily existence inside Monowitz, and this sensory environment reinforced the psychological impression that the camp functioned less like a traditional prison and more like a giant industrial machine organized around labor and production schedules. And as this develops, the role of environmental repetition becomes increasingly significant, where the same roads, factory zones, rail lines, smokestacks, and construction sites appeared again and again within daily routines, shaping memory and awareness through continuous exposure to the industrial landscape, and this repetition contributed to the sense that labor and production dominated all aspects of existence inside the camp. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the environmental transformation surrounding Monowitz reflected a larger wartime process in which industrial systems increasingly absorbed ordinary landscapes into centralized production networks supported through forced labor and authoritarian control, and this transformation demonstrated how rapidly industrial ambition could reshape entire regions under conditions of war and occupation. And as this develops further, the relationship between supervision and industrial space becomes increasingly interconnected, where fences, guard towers, open labor routes, and organized transportation systems ensured that prisoners moved through the factory environment under constant observation, reinforcing the broader systems of discipline and control operating throughout the camp. And this visibility shaped how prisoners experienced the landscape itself, where every road and work zone appeared connected to authority and industrial purpose. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners living and working inside this transformed environment over extended periods, it becomes clear that the industrial landscape became inseparable from memory of Monowitz itself, where smokestacks, railways, factory construction, machinery, and endless labor zones defined not only the physical environment but also the psychological atmosphere of the camp, and this awareness contributed to the broader perception of Monowitz as Auschwitz's industrial labor center, where production and imprisonment operated together within the same organized system, and as this develops, the connection between environmental transformation, industrial repetition, and systems of control becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operational and psychological identity of the camp. And thus, the factory landscape surrounding Monowitz can be understood as a defining component of the camp's existence, shaping the atmosphere, rhythms, and collective experience of life inside one of the largest industrial forced labor systems connected to Auschwitz. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Fear, Observation, and the Psychological Atmosphere of Monowitz. As one considers life inside Monowitz beyond the visible structures of factory labor and industrial expansion, the atmosphere of fear and constant observation emerges as one of the most defining forces shaping daily existence within the camp, and it becomes evident that control inside Monowitz operated not only through physical confinement and labor demands but also through the continuous awareness that movement, timing, and behavior remained visible within a tightly organized system built around industrial efficiency and discipline, and as this develops, the relationship between observation and psychological pressure becomes increasingly clear, where fences, guard towers, open assembly grounds, straight labor routes, and repeated inspections created an environment in which prisoners rarely escaped the feeling of being watched, and this visibility shaped awareness by transforming ordinary actions into activities performed under constant supervision, and as one reflects on the physical layout of Monowitz, it becomes clear that the camp was organized according to principles that supported observation and administrative control, where barracks stood in structured rows connected directly to assembly areas and factory roads, while open spaces allowed guards and overseers to monitor movement continuously, and this arrangement reinforced the operational identity of the camp as a place where labor and discipline depended upon uninterrupted supervision, and as this develops further, the role of industrial routine becomes increasingly significant, where repeated schedules, synchronized movement, labor formations, and factory timetables created predictable patterns through which authority maintained order, and this repetition reinforced psychological control by ensuring that daily life unfolded within systems designed to eliminate uncertainty about expectations while preserving constant awareness of authority. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of Monowitz was shaped by sounds carrying both industrial and disciplinary meaning, where whistles announced transitions between activities, shouted commands directed labor movement, machinery echoed across construction zones, and synchronized footsteps of labor columns reinforced the sense that every moment of the day belonged to a larger operational rhythm governed by supervision and production, and this sensory environment contributed to the psychological impression that Monowitz functioned as an industrial machine into which prisoners had been absorbed as labor units rather than individuals. And as this develops, the relationship between fear and routine becomes increasingly interconnected, where the predictability of schedules existed alongside the constant awareness that inspections, punishment, or intervention by authorities could occur at any stage of daily life, and this combination of repetition and uncertainty shaped the atmosphere of the camp by ensuring that ordinary routines remained psychologically tense despite their familiarity. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that fear inside Monowitz depended heavily upon the integration of industrial discipline and camp administration, where labor efficiency required systems of observation and control extending into every aspect of existence, and this integration transformed the industrial environment itself into part of the structure of psychological pressure surrounding prisoners, and as this develops further, the role of labor routes and movement patterns becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners traveled repeatedly through visible factory zones, guarded roads, and organized assembly spaces under systems of observation, reinforcing the sense that the environment itself functioned according to strict structures of authority, and this repeated exposure shaped awareness of space through the constant association between movement and supervision, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to this atmosphere over extended periods, it becomes clear that survival within Monowitz depended partly upon learning the rhythms, expectations, and visible structures of authority governing the camp, where observation of routines and careful attention to movement patterns became essential for navigating the restrictive environment surrounding them, and this adaptation reflected the gradual internalization of industrial discipline within daily existence itself, and as this develops, the connection between fear, observation, and industrial organization becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere of Auschwitz's factory camp, and thus the psychological environment of Monowitz can be understood as a system in which industrial production, visible supervision, and continuous awareness of authority combine to create an atmosphere of fear woven directly into the structure of daily life. As the systems of supervision and industrial discipline became more deeply integrated into the routines of Monowitz, their influence extended beyond direct observation into the broader psychological structure shaping how prisoners perceive time, movement, and existence within the camp, and it becomes evident that fear inside Monowitz often operated through anticipation and awareness rather than through visible intervention alone, where prisoners adjusted behavior continuously according to the expectations created by repeated inspections, organized labor routines, and the visible presence of authority throughout the industrial landscape, and as this develops, the concept of psychological adaptation becomes increasingly significant, where individuals learned to navigate the environment through close observation of schedules, movement patterns, supervisory behavior, and the rhythms of factory operation using familiarity with these systems to reduce uncertainty within the restrictive structure surrounding them, and as one reflects on the relationship between industrial labor and psychological pressure, it becomes clear that the scale and intensity of the factory environment contributed strongly to the atmosphere of Monowitz, where endless construction zones, mechanical activity, smoke rising above industrial buildings, and continuous movement of labor columns created the impression of a system operating without pause or limit, and this atmosphere reinforced awareness that prisoners existed within a structure far larger than the camp itself, connected to wartime production networks extending beyond visible boundaries, and as this develops further, the role of repetition becomes increasingly apparent, where the same roads, factory routes, assembly procedures, and labor schedules return day after day with industrial regularity, shaping how prisoners experience time through cycles of predictable movement combined with constant supervision, and this repetition contributed to the psychological exhaustion defining daily life inside Monowitz, where routine itself became inseparable from control, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the sounds and rhythms of the industrial environment reinforced the atmosphere of pressure continuously, where machinery echoed across factory zones, whistles interrupted silence at fixed intervals, trains moved through nearby rail systems, and shouted commands organized labor movement throughout the day, creating an environment in which industrial production and discipline merged into a single operational rhythm, shaping perception and awareness, and this sensory structure contributed to the feeling that Monowitz functioned according to mechanical systems extending into every aspect of existence, and as this develops, the relationship between visibility and uncertainty becomes increasingly interconnected, where prisoners understood the routines of the camp through repetition while remaining aware that authority could intervene unpredictably within those routines, and this combination preserved the atmosphere of fear by ensuring that ordinary schedules never fully eliminated tension or uncertainty inside the environment, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz represented a particularly powerful example of how industrial organization and concentration camp administration became psychologically intertwined, where labor efficiency depended not only upon physical control but also upon systems of observation and discipline shaping behavior through continuous awareness of authority, and this integration revealed how industrial structures themselves could become instruments of psychological regulation under authoritarian systems, and as this develops further, the role of collective awareness becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners living and working within shared routines developed common understandings of the atmosphere surrounding them through observation of labor movement, inspections, factory schedules, and supervisory behavior, and this collective awareness reinforced the perception of Monowitz as an environment defined by continuous pressure and industrial discipline, and as we consider the perspective of those existing within this atmosphere over long periods, it becomes clear that fear inside Monowitz was woven into ordinary routines rather than limited to isolated moments of punishment or confrontation, where industrial schedules, labor organization, and visible systems of control shaped daily existence continuously, and this awareness contributed to the broader identity of Monowitz as a camp where factory production and psychological supervision operated together within the same coordinated wartime structure, and as this develops, the connection between industrial repetition, psychological adaptation, and systems of authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operational atmosphere of the camp, and thus the psychological environment of Monowitz can be understood as a system built upon continuous observation, industrial rhythm, and the integration of fear into the ordinary routines of factory labor and camp existence. Chapter 3, Segment 3. The relationship between Auschwitz and Monowitz. As one considers the broader structure surrounding Monowitz, it becomes evident that the camp cannot be fully understood in isolation from Auschwitz itself, and as this develops, the relationship between Auschwitz I, Birkenau, and Monowitz emerges as one of the defining organizational features shaping the operation of the entire Auschwitz complex, where each section functioned according to different roles while remaining deeply connected through transportation systems, administrative coordination, labor organization, and systems of authority, and this interconnected structure shaped how Monowitz operated daily as Auschwitz's industrial labor center, and as one reflects on the origins of Monowitz within the larger Auschwitz system, it becomes clear that the camp developed during a period when the concentration camp network was expanding rapidly in response to wartime labor demands and industrial production goals, where administrators sought to integrate forced labor more directly into factory construction and industrial operation, and Monowitz emerged specifically to serve this expanding industrial function connected to the IG Farben complex near Auschwitz, and as this develops further, the physical relationship between the camps becomes increasingly significant, where railways, roads, administrative routes, and transportation systems linked Monowitz directly to other sections of Auschwitz, ensuring that prisoners, materials, records, guards, and labor assignments could move efficiently through the larger camp network, and this logistical integration reinforced the understanding that Monowitz functioned not as a separate environment but as part of a coordinated structure organized around confinement, labor, and industrial expansion. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that movement between different sections of Auschwitz contributed strongly to the atmosphere surrounding Monowitz, where trains passed through nearby rail systems, labor transports moved across roads, and administrative activity connected factory operations directly to the broader structures governing Auschwitz itself. And this atmosphere reinforced awareness that Monowitz existed within a vast operational system, extending far beyond the immediate factory zone visible to prisoners. And as this develops, the role of administration becomes increasingly apparent, where classification procedures, labor assignments, transportation schedules, inspections, and record-keeping linked Monowitz directly to Auschwitz's larger bureaucratic structure, ensuring that the camp remained fully integrated into centralized systems of control and coordination, and this administrative relationship shaped daily life inside Monowitz by connecting industrial labor routines directly to the wider concentration camp network surrounding it. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz represented a particularly significant development within the Auschwitz system, because it demonstrated how industrial production and concentration camp administration could operate together within the same coordinated framework, where economic objectives, transportation infrastructure, and forced labor became inseparable from systems of confinement and supervision, and this integration altered the meaning of the camp itself by making industrial output central to its operation. And as this develops further, the relationship between labor and transportation becomes increasingly interconnected, where prisoners assigned to Monowitz were selected, transferred, and organized according to labor needs connected directly to factory construction and production demands, and this movement reinforced the broader logistical systems linking the different sections of Auschwitz into a unified operational network. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners living inside Monowitz, it becomes clear that awareness of the larger Auschwitz complex shaped perception of the camp itself, where transportation activity, administrative procedures, and constant movement between camps reinforced the understanding that Monowitz existed within a much larger structure governed by centralized authority and industrial purpose, and this awareness contributed to the atmosphere of Monowitz as both a labor camp and a component of the wider Auschwitz system. And as this develops, the connection between industrial expansion, camp administration, and transportation systems becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operational identity of Monowitz, and thus the relationship between Auschwitz and Monowitz can be understood as a highly organized integration of industrial production, forced labor, and concentration camp administration within one of the most extensive wartime systems of confinement and industrial exploitation in occupied Europe. As the relationship between Monowitz and the wider Auschwitz complex became more deeply established, the interconnected nature of the camp system increasingly shaped both the operational structure of Monowitz and the psychological atmosphere surrounding daily life inside it. And it becomes evident that Monowitz functioned simultaneously as an industrial labor camp and as a dependent component within a much larger concentration camp network governed through centralized administration, transportation coordination, and systems of classification. Extending across Auschwitz itself, and as this develops, the concept of interconnected control becomes increasingly significant, where decisions regarding labor allocation, transportation, camp expansion, and prisoner organization flowed through administrative systems linking Monowitz directly to the broader Auschwitz structure, and this integration reinforced the understanding that industrial production at Monowitz depended entirely upon the operational mechanisms of the larger camp network, and as one reflects on the role of transportation systems connecting Monowitz to Auschwitz, it becomes clear that railways and roads served as essential links between industrial labor operations and camp administration, where prisoners, supplies, equipment, and official communication moved through carefully organized routes connecting the factory camp directly to other sections of Auschwitz, and these transportation systems reinforced the atmosphere of constant movement and coordination defining the environment surrounding Monowitz, and as this develops further, the role of classification and labor assignment becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners entering the Auschwitz system could be directed toward Monowitz according to industrial labor needs, demonstrating how economic priorities shaped administrative decisions within the camp structure itself, and this process revealed the extent to which industrial production had become integrated into the organizational logic governing Auschwitz during the war years, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the connection between Monowitz and Auschwitz shaped the atmosphere of the camp continuously, where trains moving across nearby tracks, transportation activity between camps, administrative inspections, and the visible flow of labor groups reinforced awareness that Monowitz existed within a much larger operational system extending beyond the immediate factory landscape, and this atmosphere contributed to the perception of the camp as part of a vast network organized around labor, transportation, and centralized authority, and as this develops, the relationship between industrial routine and camp administration becomes increasingly interconnected, where labor schedules inside Monowitz aligned directly with broader organizational systems governing transportation, record-keeping, supervision, and prisoner management throughout Auschwitz, and this coordination allowed the industrial labor camp to function as an integrated component within the larger wartime structure surrounding it, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz represented one of the clearest examples of how concentration camps and industrial corporations became operationally linked during the war, where factory expansion and production goals depended upon administrative systems capable of supplying, organizing, and controlling large labor populations through centralized authority, and this integration transformed both the camp and the industrial project into parts of the same coordinated machine, and as this develops further, the psychological impact of this interconnected system becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners living inside Monowitz remained constantly aware through transportation activity, administrative procedures, and labor organization that the camp formed only one section of a much larger structure beyond their immediate surroundings, and this awareness reinforced the atmosphere of scale and permanence surrounding the Auschwitz complex itself, and as we consider the perspective of those existing within this environment over extended periods, it becomes clear that Monowitz could never be experienced fully as an isolated camp because every section of daily life, from labor assignments to transportation systems and administrative control, reflected its deep integration into Auschwitz's broader operational network, and this perception shaped memory and understanding of Monowitz as both a factory labor camp and a vital component within one of the most extensive systems of industrialized confinement created during the Second World War, and as this develops, the connection between industrial production, centralized administration, and transportation infrastructure becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in maintaining the operational structure of the Auschwitz system, and thus the relationship between Auschwitz and Monowitz can be understood as a highly coordinated integration of forced labor, industrial expansion, and administrative control that shaped the structure, atmosphere, and historical significance of Auschwitz's factory camp. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Exhaustion, routine, and the physical strain of daily survival. As one considers the daily realities of life inside Monowitz beyond the visible structures of industrial expansion and administrative organization, the constant physical strain imposed by routine labor and repetitive movement emerges as one of the defining conditions shaping existence within the camp, and it becomes evident that exhaustion inside Monowitz was not experienced only through isolated moments of labor intensity but through the continuous accumulation of schedules, factory work, transportation movement, inspections, and limited recovery time woven directly into the structure of daily life, and as this develops, the relationship between industrial routine and physical depletion becomes increasingly clear, where every stage of existence inside the camp revolved around maintaining labor output within an environment designed according to factory schedules and wartime production demands, and this integration transformed ordinary human rhythms into extensions of industrial operation itself, and as one reflects on the beginning of the workday, it becomes clear that exhaustion often began before labor officially started, where prisoners woke before dawn inside crowded barracks, prepared quickly under strict schedules, assembled for roll calls, and marched through roads and industrial routes toward factory zones before work even commenced, and this repeated cycle shaped perception of time by eliminating clear separation between rest and labor, reinforcing the atmosphere of continuous operational pressure surrounding Monowitz, and as this develops further, the role of movement becomes increasingly significant, where long marches between barracks and work areas formed a daily part of existence within the camp, exposing prisoners repeatedly to weather, industrial noise, and visible systems of supervision while reinforcing awareness that nearly every moment of the day belonged to organized labor structures beyond personal control, and this repeated movement contributed directly to the physical exhaustion shaping life inside the camp. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of Monowitz carried the sounds and rhythms of relentless industrial routine, where whistles announced transitions between activities, machinery echoed across construction zones, trains moved continuously through nearby rail systems, and synchronized footsteps of labor columns created a constant operational rhythm extending from morning until night, and this sensory environment reinforced the understanding that factory production dominated every aspect of daily existence, and as this develops, the relationship between labor conditions and the environment becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners worked across construction sites, industrial zones, storage areas, and factory infrastructure under physically demanding conditions tied directly to the rapid expansion of the IG Farben complex, and this environment shaped the experience of exhaustion not only through work itself but through constant exposure to the scale and intensity of industrial activity surrounding the camp, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz represented a system in which physical strain was integrated directly into the operational structure of industrial production where labor schedules, transportation routes, supervision, and limited opportunities for recovery combined to create continuous pressure upon the prisoner population, and this integration reinforced the camp's identity as an industrial labor environment organized around production above all else, and as this develops further, the role of repetition becomes increasingly central, where the same labor routes, factory tasks, inspections, and assembly procedures repeated day after day with industrial regularity, shaping exhaustion through continuity rather than isolated events alone, and this repetition contributed to the broader psychological atmosphere of Monowitz by creating the sense that labor and fatigue extended endlessly within the environment. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to these conditions over extended periods, it becomes clear that survival depended partly upon learning how to navigate the repetitive rhythms of industrial routine while enduring the physical strain imposed by the structure of the camp itself, and this adaptation reflected the gradual normalization of exhaustion within daily existence inside Monowitz, and as this develops, the connection between industrial schedules, repetitive movement, and physical depletion becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operational atmosphere of Auschwitz's factory camp, and thus exhaustion inside Monowitz can be understood not simply as a result of labor alone but as a condition woven continuously into the routines, structures, and industrial rhythms governing every aspect of camp life. As the routines of industrial labor and organized movement continued day after day inside Monowitz, the physical strain shaping daily existence increasingly became inseparable from the broader structure of the camp itself, and it becomes evident that exhaustion functioned not merely as a temporary condition caused by difficult labor but as a constant atmosphere embedded within schedules, transportation systems, inspections, and repetitive industrial routines governing nearly every moment of life inside the camp. And as this develops, the concept of continuous strain becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners moved through cycles of waking before dawn, assembly, labor marches, factory work, inspections, and return to crowded barracks with little interruption or recovery, and this repetition shaped how time was experienced within Monowitz. By linking each day to the same industrial rhythm of production and supervision, and as one reflects on the relationship between the factory environment and physical exhaustion, it becomes clear that the industrial landscape itself reinforced the atmosphere of strain surrounding the camp, where endless construction zones, machinery, unfinished factory structures, railway systems, and large labor details created the impression of a system demanding uninterrupted physical effort in service of constant expansion, and this atmosphere shaped awareness by surrounding prisoners continuously with visible signs of industrial growth and operational intensity, and as this develops further, the role of weather and environmental exposure becomes increasingly apparent, where labor activity occurred within open construction areas, roads, and industrial zones that exposed prisoners repeatedly to cold, rain, mud, dust, smoke, and changing seasonal conditions, and this environmental exposure intensified the physical burden already created by labor schedules and long working hours, reinforcing the broader atmosphere of exhaustion defining Monowitz. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that fatigue shaped how prisoners experienced the sounds and rhythms of the camp itself, where whistles marking transitions, factory machinery, marching footsteps, railway movement, shouted commands, and industrial operations blended together into a repetitive operational background associated directly with physical effort and constant labor, and this sensory repetition contributed to the psychological impression that Monowitz functioned according to mechanical rhythms extending beyond individual endurance, and as this develops, the relationship between supervision and exhaustion becomes increasingly interconnected, where guards, overseers, and prisoner functionaries maintain strict labor discipline through continuous observation and organized movement, ensuring that production schedules remained uninterrupted despite the growing physical strain upon prisoners, and this integration reinforced the operational logic of the camp as a system organized around labor efficiency rather than human limits, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the structure of Monowitz blurred the distinction between industrial production and physical survival itself, where access to food, rest, and limited recovery existed entirely within systems controlled according to labor expectations and camp administration, and this dependence shaped the experience of daily life by tying physical endurance directly to the routines of the industrial labor system, and as this develops further, the role of adaptation becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners learned to interpret factory schedules, labor routes, assembly procedures, and supervisory patterns through repeated observation in order to navigate the exhausting structure of camp life as effectively as possible, and this adaptation reflected the gradual internalization of industrial routine within the experience of imprisonment itself, and as we consider the perspective of those existing within these conditions over long periods, it becomes clear that exhaustion inside Monowitz extended far beyond physical tiredness alone, becoming part of the broader atmosphere through which prisoners understood the camp and its endless cycles of labor, movement, and supervision, and this awareness contributed to the perception of Monowitz as an industrial environment where factory production dominated every structure of existence, and as this develops, the connection between repetitive routine, environmental exposure, and physical strain becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operational and psychological identity of the camp, and thus the exhaustion defining daily survival inside Monowitz can be understood as the product of an entire industrial system organized around continuous labor, industrial expansion, and tightly controlled routines that shaped every aspect of life within Auschwitz's factory camp. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Silence, Isolation, and the Psychological Weight of the Industrial Camp. As one considers the atmosphere of Monowitz beyond its visible structures of labor, transportation, and industrial expansion, another dimension of camp life begins to emerge through the quieter psychological conditions shaping daily existence, and it becomes evident that silence and isolation played an important role within the environment of the factory camp, where the constant rhythm of industrial production existed alongside moments of stillness, uncertainty, and emotional distance that shaped how prisoners experienced the camp internally. And as this develops, the relationship between industrial activity and psychological isolation becomes increasingly clear, where the enormous scale of the factory complex, the repetition of labor routines, and the highly organized systems of supervision contributed to an atmosphere in which individuals often experienced themselves as small components within a vast operational structure, extending far beyond their control or understanding, and this perception shaped awareness continuously throughout daily life inside Monowitz, and as one reflects on the physical structure of the camp, it becomes clear that the arrangement of barracks, assembly grounds, factory roads, fences, and industrial zones reinforced feelings of separation and restriction, where movement occurred through fixed routes and highly supervised spaces that limited opportunities for privacy or independent interaction, and this organization contributed to the broader atmosphere of isolation defining the camp, and as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly significant, where moments before dawn, periods inside crowded barracks during the night, pauses between commands, and stretches of movement across industrial roads often carried a heavy stillness shaped by exhaustion and uncertainty, and these moments contrasted sharply with the loud mechanical atmosphere of the surrounding factory environment, reinforcing the emotional tension embedded within daily routine. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that Monowitz carried two overlapping rhythms at once, where industrial machinery, railway movement, whistles, and organized labor created constant operational noise, while quieter moments inside barracks or during periods of waiting introduced an entirely different atmosphere marked by fatigue, observation, and psychological strain, and this contrast shaped how prisoners perceived the environment around them, reinforcing awareness of both the external industrial system and the internal emotional pressures of camp existence. And as this develops, the relationship between repetition and psychological burden becomes increasingly apparent, where the same roads, factory buildings, assembly areas, and labor routines returned day after day with industrial regularity, creating a sense of endless continuity that shaped perception of time within the camp, and this repetition contributed to the emotional atmosphere of Monowitz by making the future appear uncertain while daily routine remained fixed and unchanging. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that isolation inside Monowitz was intensified by the industrial structure itself, where prisoners existed within a system focused almost entirely upon production schedules and labor coordination, and this operational focus reduced opportunities for ordinary social interaction or emotional stability, reinforcing the perception that existence inside the camp revolved entirely around labor and administrative control. And as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly central, where prisoners adapted psychologically by paying close attention to routines, supervisory behavior, labor movement, and small changes within the industrial environment surrounding them, using observation as a way to navigate uncertainty and maintain awareness inside a system dominated by repetition and control. And this adaptation reflected the broader psychological adjustments required for survival inside Monowitz. And as we consider the perspective of those living within the camp over extended periods, it becomes clear that silence and isolation shaped memory of the environment as strongly as the visible factory structures themselves, where exhaustion, routine, and emotional distance became inseparable from the industrial atmosphere surrounding daily existence, and this awareness contributed to the broader identity of Monowitz as a camp where industrial production and psychological pressure operated together within the same highly organized structure. And as this develops, the connection between silence, repetition, and industrial isolation becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere of Auschwitz's factory camp. And thus, the psychological environment of Monowitz can be understood not only through labor and supervision but also through the quieter conditions of isolation, uncertainty, and emotional strain, woven into the routines of industrial existence. As the routines of industrial labor and supervision continued to dominate life inside Monowitz, the psychological atmosphere created by silence, repetition, and isolation became increasingly embedded within the daily experience of prisoners, and it becomes evident that the industrial structure of the camp shaped emotional awareness as deeply as it shaped physical routine, where the constant repetition of schedules, factory movement, and organized labor created an environment in which ordinary human rhythms were gradually replaced by mechanical cycles tied directly to production and administrative control, and as this develops, the concept of emotional distance becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners often experienced the camp through patterns of routine rather than through clear expectations about the future, and this uncertainty contributed to a psychological atmosphere shaped by exhaustion, observation, and continuous adjustment to the demands of industrial existence, and as one reflects on the visual appearance of Monowitz during periods of labor movement or nighttime stillness, it becomes clear that the factory landscape itself contributed strongly to the emotional character of the camp, where smokestacks rising above darkened industrial zones, railway tracks disappearing into distance, long rows of barracks, and guarded roads stretching between work areas created an environment that appeared both immense and deeply isolating, and this atmosphere reinforced the perception that prisoners existed inside a vast system extending far beyond their immediate surroundings. And as this develops further, the role of nighttime becomes increasingly apparent, where the temporary slowing of visible labor activity did not eliminate the atmosphere of industrial pressure surrounding the camp, and sounds of distant machinery, trains, footsteps, or occasional commands continued to remind prisoners that the operational structure of Monowitz remained active even during hours associated with rest, and this continuity blurred the distinction between labor time and personal time within the environment, reinforcing the sense that industrial routine governed every stage of existence, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that silence inside Monowitz carried a unique psychological weight precisely because it existed within an environment normally dominated by industrial sound and organized movement, where moments of quietness often heightened awareness of exhaustion, uncertainty, and restricted freedom rather than providing relief from them, and this contrast contributed to the emotional atmosphere shaping memory of the camp, and as this develops, the relationship between collective existence and isolation becomes increasingly interconnected, where prisoners lived within crowded barracks and large labor groups while still experiencing emotional separation, created by exhaustion, repetitive routine, and the overwhelming scale of the industrial system surrounding them, and this combination of collective confinement and psychological isolation shaped how individuals understood both themselves and the environment around them, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz demonstrated how industrial organization could shape not only labor systems but also emotional and psychological experience, where factory schedules, transportation routes, and repetitive routines gradually transformed ordinary patterns of human interaction and perception into structures governed by industrial logic and centralized authority, and this transformation contributed to the broader atmosphere of emotional detachment surrounding the camp, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly significant, where survivors and observers later described the industrial landscape of Monowitz not only through physical details but through the atmosphere of endless repetition, isolation, and mechanical routine defining daily life inside the camp, and these recollections reinforced the understanding that the psychological environment of Monowitz was inseparable from its industrial structure, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners enduring these conditions over long periods, it becomes clear that silence, isolation, and emotional exhaustion became woven directly into the rhythms of camp existence, shaping perception of time, labor, and survival itself within the factory system surrounding Auschwitz III, and this Awareness contributed to the broader identity of Monowitz as a place where industrial production and psychological pressure operated together within one coordinated wartime structure, and as this develops, the connection between industrial repetition, emotional isolation, and systems of control becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere of the camp, and thus the psychological weight of Monowitz can be understood as emerging not only from labor and supervision alone but from the deeper emotional conditions created by continuous industrial routine, silence, uncertainty, and isolation inside Auschwitz's factory labor camp. Chapter 4, Segment 3. The final months of Monowitz and the collapse of the industrial system. As one considers the final phase of Monowitz during the closing stages of the Second World War, the atmosphere of the camp began to shift under the growing pressure of military collapse, industrial disruption, and the weakening of the larger systems supporting Auschwitz and its surrounding labor camps, and it becomes evident that while the structures of supervision, labor, and industrial production continued to operate, the environment increasingly reflected instability and uncertainty spreading throughout the wartime system itself, and as this develops, the relationship between industrial continuity and collapse becomes increasingly clear, where factory schedules, labor routines, transportation systems, and administrative procedures attempted to maintain their established order even as the broader political and military situation surrounding the camp deteriorated rapidly, and this tension shaped the atmosphere of Monowitz during its final months, creating an environment in which familiar industrial rhythms continued within a growing sense of disruption and strain, and as one reflects on the changing conditions surrounding the IG Farben complex, it becomes clear that wartime pressures increasingly affected production and transportation across the region, where shortages, air raids, logistical difficulties, and military developments placed strain upon the industrial systems that had once appeared permanent and unstoppable, and these changes gradually altered the atmosphere surrounding Monowitz by revealing the vulnerability of the industrial structure upon which the camp depended, and as this develops further, the role of transportation becomes increasingly significant, where railway systems that had long supported the movement of labor, equipment, fuel, and industrial materials now reflected growing instability through delays, interruptions, and increased uncertainty regarding movement across the region, and this weakening of transportation networks affected both factory operations and the broader administrative structure linking Monowitz to Auschwitz and the wider wartime system, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the industrial atmosphere surrounding Monowitz began to change during the final months of the war, where factory sounds, construction activity, railway movement, and organized labor routines continued but increasingly existed alongside signs of disruption, tension, and uncertainty, and this altered atmosphere shaped perception of the camp by revealing that the industrial system dominating daily existence was no longer functioning with the same stability and confidence visible during earlier periods of expansion, and as this develops, the relationship between routine and instability becomes increasingly interconnected, where prisoners continued to move through familiar labor schedules, assembly procedures, and industrial routes while simultaneously observing changes in transportation activity, administrative behavior, and the atmosphere surrounding the factory complex, and this coexistence of repetition and disruption contributed to the psychological uncertainty defining the final phase of Monowitz, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the collapse unfolding around the camp exposed how deeply Monowitz depended upon larger systems of wartime organization, where industrial production, transportation infrastructure, centralized administration, and military control all function together as parts of the same coordinated structure, and the weakening of any one element increasingly affected the entire environment surrounding the camp, and as this develops further, the role of observation becomes increasingly central, where prisoners interpreted changing conditions through visible signs such as altered schedules, movement of personnel, changes in factory operation, and growing tension within the camp administration, using these observations to understand the uncertain future unfolding around them, and this awareness shaped the atmosphere of Monowitz during its final months by creating a sense that the industrial system itself was beginning to fracture, and as we consider the perspective of those living within the camp during this period, it becomes clear that the final phase of Monowitz was experienced through a combination of familiar industrial routine and visible instability, where labor continued within an environment increasingly marked by uncertainty and collapse, and this experience reinforced the broader identity of Monowitz as a camp inseparably tied to the wartime industrial system surrounding Auschwitz, and as this develops, the connection between industrial decline, transportation disruption, and psychological uncertainty becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere of the camp's final months. And thus, the later phase of Monowitz can be understood as a period in which the systems of industrial labor and administrative control continued to function within an environment steadily moving toward collapse. As the final months of Monowitz continued and the broader wartime situation surrounding Auschwitz deteriorated further, the industrial systems that had once defined the camp with relentless stability increasingly showed signs of exhaustion, disruption, and decline, and it becomes evident that the weakening of factory production, transportation coordination, and centralized administration altered the atmosphere of Monowitz in profound ways, where the industrial rhythm shaping daily existence no longer appeared entirely fixed or permanent, and as this develops, the concept of visible collapse becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners observed gradual changes in factory activity, transportation movement, labor organization, and administrative behavior that revealed the growing instability surrounding the camp and the industrial project connected to it, and these observations contributed to an atmosphere of uncertainty that spread throughout daily life inside Monowitz, and as one reflects on the role of the IG Farben complex during this final period, it becomes clear that the enormous industrial project surrounding the camp had become deeply dependent upon wartime systems now under severe pressure from military developments and logistical breakdown, where shortages of materials, transportation difficulties, and the changing conditions of the war increasingly disrupted the continuous expansion and production that had once defined the environment, and this weakening altered the visual and operational atmosphere surrounding the camp itself, and as this develops further, the relationship between industrial routine and psychological awareness becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners continued to follow familiar schedules of labor, assembly, and movement while simultaneously recognizing that the systems organizing those routines were becoming less stable and more uncertain, and this contradiction shaped perception by creating an environment in which repetition remained visible even as the larger structure supporting it weakened steadily, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of Monowitz during its final months carried a different emotional tone than earlier periods of expansion, where industrial sounds and factory activity continued but increasingly existed alongside signs of interruption, tension, and reduced operational confidence. And this sensory shift reinforced awareness that the industrial machine dominating daily existence was no longer functioning with the same force and permanence that had characterized earlier years of the camp, and as this develops, the role of movement and evacuation becomes increasingly significant, where transportation systems and organized transfers began to reflect the broader collapse affecting Auschwitz and the surrounding region, and this growing instability in movement patterns contributed to the atmosphere of uncertainty surrounding both prisoners and camp authorities during the final phase of Monowitz, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the collapse of Monowitz revealed the extent to which industrial production, concentration camp administration, and wartime logistics had become deeply interconnected, where the weakening of military control and transportation infrastructure directly affected the operation of the camp and the factory system surrounding it, and this interconnectedness demonstrated how dependent the industrial labor camp had always been upon larger structures of centralized wartime organization, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly important, where later reflections on Monowitz often emphasized not only the industrial intensity of the camp during its years of operation but also the strange atmosphere of transition and uncertainty marking its final phase, when the once relentless factory system began to slow and fragment under the pressure of collapse, and these recollections reinforced the understanding that the end of Monowitz was experienced gradually through visible changes in routine and atmosphere rather than through a single sudden moment alone, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners living through this period, it becomes clear that the final months of Monowitz combined familiar structures of industrial labor with growing awareness that the wartime system surrounding the camp was approaching its end, and this coexistence of continuity and collapse shaped the final psychological atmosphere of Auschwitz's factory camp. And as this develops, the connection between industrial decline, administrative instability, and collective uncertainty becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in defining the closing phase of Monowitz, and thus the final months of the camp can be understood as a period in which the industrial systems that had once appeared endless and mechanically unstoppable gradually weakened under the broader collapse of the wartime structure that had created and sustained Auschwitz's slave labor factory. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Liberation, Memory, and the Remains of the Factory Camp. As one considers the final transformation of Monowitz after the collapse of the wartime system surrounding Auschwitz, the camp gradually shifted from an active industrial labor environment into a place remembered through ruins, testimony, preserved records, and historical reflection. And it becomes evident that the end of Monowitz did not erase the structures or systems that had shaped life inside the camp, but instead transformed them into historical evidence through which later generations would attempt to understand the relationship between industrial production, forced labor, and centralized authority during the Second World War, and as this develops, the relationship between liberation and memory becomes increasingly clear, where the dismantling of the camp system marked not only the end of organized industrial confinement but also the beginning of a long process of interpretation and remembrance shaped by survivors, historians, preserved landscapes, and physical remains left behind across the region surrounding Auschwitz. And this process altered the meaning of Monowitz itself, transforming it from a functioning factory labor camp into a historical site connected deeply to broader questions regarding industry, responsibility, and human systems of control, and as one reflects on the physical condition of Monowitz following the collapse of the camp, it becomes clear that the environment carried visible traces of the industrial world that had once dominated the region, where railway lines, factory foundations, damaged industrial structures, roads, and remnants of barracks continued to shape the landscape even after labor routines and administrative systems had disappeared, and these remains reinforced awareness of the enormous industrial project that had once operated beside Auschwitz, and as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly significant where spaces once filled with machinery, labor movement, whistles, and organized supervision gradually became quiet, and this silence transformed perception of the landscape by emphasizing absence rather than industrial activity, creating an atmosphere in which the remains of the camp carried emotional and historical weight through stillness and emptiness. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the disappearance of industrial rhythm altered the character of Monowitz completely, where the sounds of trains, construction, factory operations, and labor columns were replaced by open spaces, ruins, and preserved fragments of infrastructure standing without the systems that had once animated them, and this contrast contributed strongly to the process through which Monowitz became understood as a historical site rather than an active industrial environment, and as this develops, the relationship between memory and physical space becomes increasingly apparent, where roads, factory remnants, railway systems, and surviving camp structures continued to communicate aspects of the environment even after the collapse of the camp itself, and these physical remains shaped historical understanding by preserving visible evidence of how industrial expansion and forced labor had once operated together within the same landscape, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz occupies a unique position within the history of Auschwitz because it revealed the direct integration of industrial corporations and concentration camp systems into a coordinated wartime structure where factory production and forced labor became operationally inseparable, and this historical significance shaped how later generations interpreted the camp and its role within the larger history of industrialized violence and authoritarian organization, and as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes increasingly central, where survivors and observers described not only the physical conditions of Monowitz but also the atmosphere of industrial repetition, exhaustion, supervision, and emotional isolation defining daily life inside the camp, and these accounts became essential for preserving the psychological and human dimensions of the environment beyond its surviving physical remains alone, and as we consider the perspective of those reflecting upon Monowitz after the war, it becomes clear that memory of the camp depended upon understanding both the industrial structures visible across the landscape and the systems of labor and control that had once operated within them, and this awareness contributed to the broader historical identity of Monowitz as Auschwitz's factory camp, where industrial ambition and systems of forced labor merged into one organized wartime environment, and as this develops, the connection between memory, physical remains, and historical interpretation becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in preserving understanding of the camp and its operation, and thus the transformation of Monowitz after liberation can be understood as the beginning of an ongoing process through which the industrial labor camp became part of historical memory, reflection, and continued examination of how modern systems of production and authority were used within the wartime concentration camp network. As the years following the collapse of Monowitz continued to pass, the process of remembering and interpreting the camp gradually became more deeply connected to broader historical questions regarding industry, labor, transportation, and the role of organized systems within the concentration camp network surrounding Auschwitz, and it becomes evident that Monowitz remained historically significant not only because of the suffering experienced within the camp itself, but because it demonstrated with unusual clarity how industrial production and forced labor could become fully integrated within a centralized wartime structure. And as this develops, the concept of industrial memory becomes increasingly significant, where the surviving roads, rail lines, factory remains, and preserved records associated with Monowitz continued to communicate aspects of the environment long after the industrial rhythms of the camp had disappeared, and these physical traces shaped how historians and visitors understood the scale and organization of the factory labor system that once operated there. And as one reflects on the preserved landscape surrounding the former camp area, it becomes clear that the environment itself still carries signs of transformation created during the war years, where industrial foundations, altered terrain, transportation routes, and remnants of factory infrastructure reveal how thoroughly the region had been reshaped by wartime production and forced labor, and this physical transformation contributed to the lasting identity of Monowitz within the broader history of Auschwitz and industrialized labor systems. And as this develops further, the role of historical study becomes increasingly apparent, where archives, survivor testimony, photographs, transportation records, factory documents, and administrative correspondence have allowed later generations to reconstruct how Monowitz functioned as part of a coordinated industrial and concentration camp network, and these materials demonstrate the extent to which factory expansion, transportation systems, and prisoner labor were integrated into the daily operation of the camp. And as we consider the sensory aspects of memory, it becomes evident that many later reflections on Monowitz emphasize the contrast between the industrial noise that once defined the camp and the silence that followed its collapse, where the disappearance of machinery, labor, columns, whistles, and construction activity transformed the atmosphere of the landscape entirely. And this contrast reinforced awareness that the industrial environment dominating the camp for years had eventually disappeared, leaving behind only fragments and memory. And as this develops, the relationship between industrial systems and human experience becomes increasingly interconnected, where historians and survivors alike have reflected upon how factory schedules, labor organization, transportation infrastructure, and administrative efficiency shaped not only physical conditions inside Monowitz but also the psychological atmosphere of repetition, exhaustion, and emotional isolation defining life within the camp. And this understanding contributed to broader interpretations of how industrial structures themselves could become instruments of authoritarian control under wartime conditions. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the history of Monowitz serves as a reminder that industrial progress and technological organization are not inherently separate from moral responsibility, where systems designed for production and economic expansion can become deeply connected to exploitation and human suffering when controlled through authoritarian power and forced labor. And this lesson has shaped why Monowitz continues to hold historical importance beyond the boundaries of Auschwitz alone. And as this develops further, the role of remembrance becomes increasingly central, where preserving the history of Monowitz requires more than documenting factory construction or camp administration, demanding continued attention to the daily routines, industrial atmosphere, systems of observation, and psychological conditions shaping existence inside the camp, and this broader understanding ensures that Monowitz is remembered not simply as an industrial site but as a place where organized production and concentration camp systems became inseparably linked, and as we consider the perspective of those encountering this history. Today, it becomes clear that Monowitz remains significant because it reveals how modern industrial systems, transportation infrastructure, centralized planning, and forced labor were combined into one coordinated structure during the war, and this awareness contributes to ongoing reflection regarding the responsibilities connected to industry, authority, and historical memory itself, and as this develops, the connection between remembrance, industrial history, and moral reflection becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in shaping understanding of Monowitz and its place within the history of Auschwitz, and thus the memory of Monowitz can be understood as an enduring reminder of how industrial ambition, centralized authority, and systems of forced labor combined to create one of the most extensive factory labor camps within the wartime concentration camp system. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Historical Responsibility and the Meaning of Industrialized Forced Labor. As one reflects on the broader historical significance of Monowitz beyond the physical structures and wartime routines that once defined the camp, the question of historical responsibility emerges as one of the most important themes connected to its legacy, and it becomes evident that Monowitz occupies a unique position within the history of the Second World War because it revealed how industrial ambition, centralized planning, transportation systems, and forced labor could become fully integrated into one coordinated structure operating on a massive scale, and as this develops, the relationship between industry and authority becomes increasingly clear, where factories, railways, construction projects, labor schedules, and administrative systems were organized not only to support wartime production but also to sustain a system of confinement built around exploitation and continuous supervision, and this integration shaped the historical meaning of Monowitz long after the camp itself disappeared, and as one reflects on the industrial environment surrounding Auschwitz III, it becomes clear that Monowitz differed from many other camps because factory production stood visibly at the center of its operation, where smokestacks, rail systems, construction zones, and organized labor movement dominated the landscape and communicated immediately that economic goals and forced labor had become inseparable within the environment, and this visibility has remained central to later historical interpretation of the camp, and as this develops further, the role of industrial corporations becomes increasingly significant, where companies connected to wartime production participated directly in projects relying upon prisoner labor supplied through the concentration camp system, and this relationship demonstrated how industrial structures and authoritarian administration could function together through shared operational objectives, and as we consider the sensory aspects of historical memory, it becomes evident that descriptions of Monowitz often emphasize the overwhelming industrial atmosphere surrounding the camp, where machinery, transportation systems, repetitive schedules, factory construction, and labor movement created an environment defined by mechanical rhythm and organized production, and this atmosphere contributed strongly to the perception of Monowitz as a place where human existence had been subordinated almost entirely to industrial output and wartime demand, and as this develops, the relationship between efficiency and moral responsibility becomes increasingly apparent, where the systems organizing Monowitz operated with administrative precision through transportation schedules, labor allocation, construction planning, and centralized coordination, yet these same systems functioned within a structure built upon coercion and forced labor, and this contradiction has shaped much of the later reflections surrounding the camp and its historical meaning, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz challenges assumptions regarding industrial progress and organizational efficiency by demonstrating how modern systems of planning and production can become deeply connected to exploitation when separated from ethical responsibility and human dignity, and this lesson extends beyond the specific history of Auschwitz into broader questions regarding the relationship between technology, labor, and authority in the modern world, and as this develops further, the role of historical study becomes increasingly central, where archives, industrial records, survivor testimony, transportation documents, and preserved camp remains have allowed historians to reconstruct how Monowitz functioned operationally within the larger wartime economy, and these studies reveal the extent to which industrial expansion and forced labor became mutually dependent within the camp system itself, and as we consider the perspective of those reflecting upon Monowitz after the war, it becomes clear that the camp's significance lies not only in the suffering experienced within it but also in the organizational structures that made such a system possible, where industrial production, transportation infrastructure, centralized administration, and concentration camp labor operated together through coordinated planning and bureaucratic control, and this awareness contributes to the broader understanding of Monowitz as one of the clearest examples of industrialized forced labor during the war years, and as this develops, the connection between historical responsibility, industrial systems, and memory becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in shaping reflection upon the camp and its lasting significance, and thus the history of Monowitz can be understood as a reminder that industrial organization and technological progress remain inseparable from questions of human responsibility, ethical limits, and the consequences of systems built upon exploitation and centralized authority. As the historical meaning of Monowitz continued to be examined in the decades following the war, the camp increasingly became understood not only as a site of forced labor within Auschwitz, but also as a symbol of how industrial systems can become integrated into structures of authoritarian power when economic ambition and centralized control override moral responsibility, and it becomes evident that the legacy of Monowitz extends beyond the boundaries of the former camp itself into broader reflections upon the role of modern industry, transportation, infrastructure, administrative organization, and labor systems within times of political extremity and war, and as this develops, the concept of industrialized control becomes increasingly significant, where the routines, schedules, factory operations, and transportation networks shaping Monowitz revealed how large-scale industrial environments could be organized according to principles that treated labor entirely as a resource to be managed and controlled, and this operational logic shaped both the physical structure and psychological atmosphere of the camp. And as one reflects on the relationship between technology and authority inside Monowitz, it becomes clear that the industrial systems surrounding the camp depended heavily upon coordination, planning, and efficiency, where railway systems carried materials and labor groups through fixed schedules, construction projects expanded according to centralized directives, and factory production relied upon carefully organized labor allocation tied directly to camp administration, and this integration demonstrated how technological and bureaucratic systems can become deeply intertwined with authoritarian structures when ethical limits are removed from decision-making processes, and as this develops further, the role of routine becomes increasingly apparent where the repetitive industrial rhythms governing Monowitz transformed daily existence into a cycle structured almost entirely around production demands, transportation, schedules, and systems of supervision, and this repetition shaped not only labor conditions but also the psychological atmosphere of the camp, where industrial routine itself became part of the mechanism of control operating inside the environment. And as we consider the sensory aspects of historical remembrance, it becomes evident that the memory of Monowitz is often connected to images and descriptions of constant industrial movement, smoke rising above factory zones, trains crossing the surrounding landscape, labor columns marching toward construction sites, and machinery operating continuously across the industrial complex. And these sensory impressions reinforce the understanding that Monowitz functioned less like an isolated prison and more like a massive production environment built directly around forced labor and centralized organization. And as this develops, the relationship between memory and responsibility becomes increasingly interconnected, where preserving the history of Monowitz requires acknowledging not only the existence of the camp itself but also the industrial systems, corporate involvement, transportation, structures, and administrative coordination that allowed the environment to operate on such a large scale. And this broader awareness has shaped ongoing historical discussions regarding accountability, institutional responsibility, and the ethical obligations connected to industrial and governmental power. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz continues to hold significance because it demonstrates how modern systems designed for economic and technological expansion can become instruments of exploitation when human beings are reduced to components within centralized structures of labor and production. And this lesson remains historically important because the organizational principles visible at Monowitz were not chaotic or improvised but highly coordinated and methodically planned. And as this develops further, the role of education and historical preservation becomes increasingly central, where museums, archives, historical studies, and memorial sites connected to Auschwitz continue to examine Monowitz as part of the larger history of industrialized forced labor and wartime production, and these efforts ensure that the camp's history remains connected to broader reflection regarding the responsibilities accompanying industrial development and centralized authority. And as we consider the perspective of later generations encountering the history of Monowitz, it becomes clear that the camp serves not only as a historical record of wartime exploitation but also as a warning regarding the dangers that emerge when efficiency, expansion, and industrial ambition are separated from ethical responsibility and respect for human dignity. And this understanding contributes to the lasting significance of Monowitz within the broader history of the 20th century. And as this develops, the connection between industrial organization, historical responsibility, and collective memory becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in shaping how Monowitz is remembered and interpreted today. And thus the historical legacy of Monowitz can be understood as an enduring reminder that systems of production, transportation, and centralized authority carry profound ethical consequences when placed within structures built upon coercion, exploitation, and absolute control. Chapter 5, Segment 3: Reflection, Memory, and the Lasting Legacy of Monowitz. As one reflects upon the complete history of Monowitz, from its origins beside the expanding IG Farben factory complex to its collapse during the final months of the war, it becomes evident that the camp stands as one of the clearest examples of how industrial systems and concentration camp administration became deeply interconnected during the 20th century, And as this develops, the relationship between memory and historical understanding becomes increasingly significant, where the preserved records, survivor testimony, remaining industrial traces, and broader history of Auschwitz together shape how later generations interpret Monowitz and the environment that once existed there, and this process of remembrance has transformed the former factory labor camp into a lasting historical symbol connected not only to wartime forced labor but also to larger questions regarding modern industry, centralized organization, and human responsibility. And as one reflects on the physical environment surrounding Monowitz today, it becomes clear that much of the industrial landscape which once dominated the region has changed or disappeared. Yet, traces of roads, rail lines, foundations, and altered terrain continue to reveal how thoroughly the wartime system reshaped the area around Auschwitz III, and these surviving elements contribute to historical memory by preserving visible reminders of the industrial structures that once organized daily existence within the camp. And as this develops further, the role of silence becomes increasingly important, where spaces once filled with machinery, whistles, construction activity, factory operations, and labor movement now exist in relative quiet, and this silence creates a powerful contrast with the industrial intensity that defined Monowitz during the war years, reinforcing awareness of absence and historical distance while simultaneously preserving the emotional weight of the environment. And as we consider the sensory aspects of remembrance, it becomes evident that memory of Monowitz remains strongly connected to images and impressions of industrial repetition, where trains crossed the landscape continuously, smoke rose above factory zones, labor columns moved through roads under supervision, and machinery shaped the rhythm of every day, and these recurring images continue to define historical understanding of the camp as a place where industrial production dominated nearly every aspect of existence. And as this develops, the relationship between historical reflection and moral awareness becomes increasingly apparent, where studying Monowitz requires confronting the reality that highly organized industrial systems, transportation infrastructure, and centralized planning were used not only for economic development but also for exploitation and forced labor within the concentration camp structure, and this realization challenges assumptions that efficiency and technological progress are automatically linked to ethical advancement, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that Monowitz remains historically important because it demonstrates how ordinary elements of modern industrial society such as railways, factories, schedules, administrative offices, and production systems can become integrated into structures of coercion when guided by authoritarian power and stripped of moral restraint. And this lesson continues to shape why the camp is studied and remembered today. And as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes increasingly central, where survivors and witnesses described not only the physical conditions of factory labor but also the emotional atmosphere created by endless repetition, industrial noise, exhaustion, supervision, and psychological isolation. And these testimonies preserve dimensions of the camp that cannot be understood through industrial records or physical remains alone, connecting memory directly to lived experience within the environment. And as we consider the perspective of later generations encountering the history of Monowitz, it becomes clear that the camp continues to serve as a warning regarding the dangers of systems that prioritize expansion, efficiency, and centralized control above human dignity and ethical responsibility, and this awareness contributes to the broader significance of Monowitz within the historical memory of Auschwitz and the Second World War itself, and as this develops, the connection between remembrance, industrial history, and moral reflection becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in shaping understanding of the camp and its legacy, and thus the memory of Monowitz can be understood as both a historical record of industrialized forced labor and an enduring reminder of the responsibilities connected to modern systems of production, authority, and human organization. As the history of Monowitz continues to be studied and remembered decades after the collapse of the camp, its legacy increasingly serves as a point of reflection not only upon the wartime past but also upon the broader relationship between modern industrial systems and human responsibility in the contemporary world, and it becomes evident that Monowitz occupies a unique place within the historical memory of Auschwitz because it exposed with unusual clarity how industrial production, transportation networks, corporate involvement, centralized planning, and concentration camp labor could function together as parts of a single coordinated structure. And as this develops, the concept of industrial morality becomes increasingly significant, where the history of Monowitz forces later generations to consider how technological progress, economic expansion, and organizational efficiency can become detached from ethical responsibility when systems of authority operate without accountability or respect for human dignity. And this reflection remains central to understanding the lasting meaning of the camp today, and as one reflects on the preserved history of Monowitz, it becomes clear that remembrance depends upon more than preserving physical remains alone, where archives, survivor accounts, transportation documents, factory records, photographs, and historical studies together create a detailed picture of how daily life functioned inside the industrial labor camp, and these materials reveal the extent to which labor schedules, factory construction, railway systems, and systems of supervision shaped every aspect of existence within the environment. And as this develops further, the role of education becomes increasingly apparent, where memorial institutions and historical researchers continue examining Monowitz not only as part of Auschwitz history but also as a broader example of industrialized exploitation and centralized wartime organization, and these efforts ensure that the camp remains connected to larger discussions regarding authority, technology, labor systems, and ethical responsibility in modern societies. And as we consider the sensory aspects of historical memory, it becomes evident that descriptions of Monowitz continue to evoke the industrial atmosphere that once defined the camp, where smoke, machinery, rail movement, construction zones, repetitive schedules, and endless labor formed the backdrop to daily existence, and these sensory impressions remain essential because they communicate how completely the industrial environment shaped the psychological and physical reality of prisoners inside the camp. And as this develops, the relationship between routine and historical understanding becomes increasingly interconnected, where the repetitive nature of labor, transportation, supervision, and industrial expansion revealed how systems of exploitation often function not through chaos alone but through organization, continuity, and normalized procedure. And this realization remains historically important because it demonstrates how ordinary structures of administration and production can become instruments of oppression when ethical boundaries collapse. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the history of Monowitz continues to resonate because it challenges the assumption that modern industrial society is automatically guided by moral progress, instead revealing how advanced systems of engineering, logistics, and economic planning can be directed toward exploitation under authoritarian conditions. and this warning remains relevant far beyond the specific historical context of the Second World War, and as this develops further, the role of collective memory becomes increasingly central, where remembrance of Monowitz depends upon continued willingness to examine uncomfortable historical realities regarding industrial corporations, centralized authority, and the use of forced labor within modern production systems, and this process of reflection ensures that the history of the camp remains connected to ongoing conversations regarding ethics, responsibility, and the protection of human dignity in industrial societies. And as we consider the perspective of those studying Monowitz today, it becomes clear that the camp endures in historical memory not only because of the suffering experienced within its boundaries, but because it revealed how deeply industrial ambition and authoritarian systems could become intertwined during the war years, and this understanding contributes to the lasting significance of Monowitz within both Holocaust history and the broader history of modern industrial civilization. And as this develops, the connection between historical memory, ethical reflection, and industrial responsibility becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforces the others in shaping the enduring legacy of Auschwitz's factory labor camp. And thus, the story of Monowitz remains an essential reminder that systems of production, transportation, administration, and technological progress must always remain tied to human responsibility and moral accountability if societies are to prevent industrial power from becoming an instrument of exploitation and control once again. Monowitz was built beside factories, rail lines, and construction zones that symbolized modern industry and expansion during wartime Europe. Yet behind the machinery, schedules, and industrial organization stood a system built upon forced labor, supervision, exhaustion, and absolute control. The camp revealed how production, transportation, and centralized authority could become deeply connected within a structure that reduced human beings to labor inside an enormous industrial machine. As we reflect on the history of Monowitz, it becomes evident that its legacy extends far beyond the physical remains of the camp itself. It forces us to examine how modern systems of industry, administration, and technology can be used when ethical responsibility disappears and human dignity is ignored. The roads, railways, factory foundations, and testimonies left behind continue to remind us that organized systems are never morally neutral on their own. Their meaning depends entirely on the values guiding them. The story of Monowitz remains difficult, but it is essential to study carefully and responsibly, because understanding how these systems operated helps preserve historical awareness for future generations. Memory carries responsibility, and reflection remains one of the most important ways history continues to speak to the present. If you value long-form historical documentaries told with calm narration, deep research, and historical responsibility, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps continue these detailed explorations into history, memory, industry, and the environments that shape the modern world. Thank you for watching.